Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 31st of August of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the South Donetsk direction, because very interesting updates and details are coming from this territory. According to information we have, the 72nd Brigade of the Ukraine Armed Forces was withdrawn from the Ugledar direction and is being transferred to the Kursk region. We got this report this morning somewhere at 8-9 a.m. of the local time, but most likely the Ukrainians decided to redeploy the 72nd Brigade not to the Kursk direction but to the Pokrovsk direction, with the purpose to stabilize the line of combat contact. Later, the same information was confirmed by pro-Ukrainian sources. They were not saying about the direction, but the only thing they confirmed that the Ukrainians decided to redeploy, and most likely the Ukrainians have already finished the process, because today we got the first updates that the Russians began full-scale offensive operation towards first the city of Vajana. So if you remember, during the previous few days we were talking a lot about the territory, and we have sent changes on the ground. According to pro-Russian sources, the Russians colored almost everything in the vicinity of Vajana. So if we summarize everything, we can make a conclusion that by the morning of the 31st of August, the Russians were already controlling something like this, right? Let's say before the beginning of possible offensive operation in direction of Vajana. And starting off today, the Russians entered the village itself, and currently there are very heavy clashes. We don't know for sure whether the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village or the Ukrainians managed to repel this attack. Obviously, we're gonna find this out just tomorrow, after this upcoming night from the 31st of August on the 1st of September. But most likely, if the information about the redeployment of the 72nd Brigade is correct, then most likely the Ukrainians would lose the city of Vajana, and if the Ukrainians lose the city of Vajana, then they will lose everything in this direction. We are talking about the city of Ugledar and the coal mines around. So very heavy clashes are taking place right now in this direction. As for Constantinovka, just 2 days ago the Russians raised the flag in the most western part of the city, of the village, of the ruins that led from the village, and now the Russians are trying to improve their positions along the fields between the village of Constantinovka and the village of Pobeda. This is Pobeda. So according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours the Russians improved their positions and captured additional 3 lines in the fortifications. This information was confirmed by different mappers. We understand that the main purpose of the Russians is to establish secure connection between Constantinovka itself and Pobeda itself along T0524 road. In the past, the Ukrainians were using this road for main supply. Now the Russians are going to do the same. But the problem is that Ukrainians have their positions along these fortifications, and of course this is going to be another pain for the Russians, because to secure this road, first of all the Russians need to force the Ukrainians to fall back from this defense belt. Of course, I have no doubts that the Russians are able to do this. The question is how much time the Russians need for this. Now let's move further. Let's talk about Maximillianka. It's like something like Kurakhova, already the Kurakhova direction, and during the previous 24 hours we started receiving additional updates from this about the situation in this area. The video was published by the 42nd Air Mobile Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and in this video we can see a significant number of tanks, armored vehicles, personal carriers, forces, troopers that were attacking the Ukrainian positions inside of the city of Maximillianka. As you can see, there are a lot of episodes, a lot of destroyed vehicles. Some of the episodes were geolocated, and this is, for example, one of the points that Ukrainians were actively withdrawing the Russian forces. So we can make a conclusion that the Russians renewed their attempts to attack and to establish complete control over the city of Maximillianka, trying to force the Ukrainians to fall back, and this is a very important direction. We have another video from the farms. In this video we can see how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions in farms, and the author of this video reported that right in front of our screens we can see something like artillery preparation before a full-scale offensive operation of the Russian forces. So most likely these farms were captured by the Russians, these barracks, and maybe the Russians managed to get deep as possible inside of the city of Maximillianka. Maybe the Russians managed to reach the central part. What is the value of this direction of this village? And the main value is that if the Russians are able to enter and to get the northwestern part of the village, then the Russians will be able to establish complete fire control, sometimes in physical control, over the supply roads that goes from Kurakhova itself, from the main logistic hub, to the Ukrainian positions in the Selidova, Karlovka, Girnik direction. So as you know, and today lots of sources, lots of military experts were talking about the Cauldron, for the Ukrainian forces that is about to be created by the Russians, and we are talking about these fields. Currently, according to Western military experts, there are around three brigades concentrated in these fields. According to some sources, the Ukrainians have already launched evacuation, and they have already begun abandoning their positions towards more reliable towns and cities. But obviously, the Ukrainians will not be able to evacuate all their soldiers. Obviously, some soldiers, some group of forces would be left by the Ukrainians, and of course they would be encircled. It's normal because the Ukrainians understand that now they need to win some time, and if the Russians are able to encircle, let's say 500 soldiers completely fully loaded with ammo and munition, and if these soldiers are highly motivated, of course the Ukrainians will be able to get maybe 3-4 days until these forces surrender. So this is the situation, and of course, so the Russians, as we can see, are trying to block the supply, the evacuation and roads from on the line Girnik, Maximillianka, Kastrovskaya. So the Russians trying to improve their positions here, and the Russians continue their offensive on the line Karlovka, Galicinovka, and Dalinovka, Novosel, Zhelana Pershaya, and Zhelana Druga. So we have a lot of geolocations during the day. We have flags as usually. Almost every single day we get another video with the flag, and this video we can see how the Russians raise their flag above the farms that located a little bit souther from the village of Karlovka. This video confirms complete control over this stronghold. Later we got updates from pro-Ukrainian mappers. According to them, as you can see, the Russians managed to establish significant control over significant territories. Lots of square kilometers were captured by the Russians just during one night. And right after this post, the Russian sources published the video how they were raising the flag. And once again, the flag was raised by 114th Brigade of the Armed Forces of Russian Federation. And this is, and let's say it's Russian Federation forces, of course, but this is the Brigade of DPR. So it's like local brigade. It's mainly this brigade consists of the former Ukrainians, let's call them like this. It's the people from Donetsk, from Gorlovka, from Marinka, from all over the inside DPR or something like this. So, and during the previous months, they managed to capture a lot of towns. They were the first who raised their flag above the Avdiivka Telecom. They raised a lot of flags in the Pokrov's direction. So as you can see, this is one of the most powerful, one of the most successful group of forces that continue moving further deep inside of the territory of Ukraine. So the flag was raised and the territory was colored in Russian favor. Later, we continue receiving additional updates, and the sources reported that the Russians managed to establish complete control over Galicinovka. Later, we got report that the Russians managed to establish complete control over Dalinovka, and as you can see, these two updates that we just discussed were confirmed by different mappers, pro-Ukrainian, neutral, and pro-Russian mappers, and so on. And as for reports that have no confirmations from different mappers, the Russians, after the fall of Galicinovka and Dalinovka, moved further in the southern direction, and first they answered the village of Zhelana Pershaya, and according to information there are very heavy clashes. Assault operations are underway in the village of Zhelana first, and taking the village is a matter of time. That was posted by the Russian sources. Next will be the Zhelana the second, and the second Zhelana is located a little bit to the south, and we are talking about this territory. And if the Russians are able to take under control Zhelana first and Zhelana Druga, these two villages, then the Russians would be able to close Cauldron and to encircle the Ukrainians completely. There are going to be some positions, some fields that Ukrainians can use for evacuation, but I would like to remind you that these fields has very limited space. First of all, don't forget that there is a water barrier. This is the water barrier I'm talking about. This is Zhukovskaya water reservoir, the river of Lazova. This is it, and of course the Ukrainians will not be able to swim through this water reservoir, so they can see they don't have a lot of space for evacuation. And the military experts are saying that the Russians are not not going to create a complete 100% cauldron. They will leave some window for the Ukrainians, because the experts are saying it requires a lot of energy, a lot of forces to hold, let's say, 2,000-3,000 of Ukrainian soldiers inside of the cauldron. And the most important, to keep 2,000-3,000 soldiers in the cauldron will cost Russian time, and time in the perspective of the Pokrovsk offensive operation is the most important value, and this is the most important money. Who has time will of course obviously win the battle for the Pokrovsk direction. So that's why the sources are saying that the Russians will keep some window for the Ukrainians. They will be able to use this window for evacuation, let's call it like this. And of course the Russians will bomb and attack this territory with artillery, and most likely the Ukrainians will lose up to 60 or even 70% of the personal, armored vehicles and everything they have during this evacuation. Of course it's not 100%, but obviously the rest 30 will not be able to continue clashes, and most likely they will be completely demoralized and have no wish to continue the war with Russia. Now let's move further. According to information we have, the Russians also entered the village of Lysivka. This is not the first day when we received this type of report. According to information we have, the Russians entered the village of Lysivka yesterday, and maybe those were sabotage and reconnaissance group, and they were trying to dig in deeper. And today we got report that the parts of Russian regular army got as close as possible to the city of Ukrainsk from the north. So most likely tomorrow the clashes for this territory is going to start, and if Ukrainians lose Ukrainsk, then the Russians will be able to move further their FPV drone fire control over supply roads, and this can lead to complete collapse of the entire direction. As for the supply roads, 3 days in a row the Russians are keeping their focus above this line. So currently the Ukrainians are using the next supply road. They're moving their forces from Vishnyovo along the railways to the city of Tsukurne, then along the railways further in direction of Girnik, and then from Girnik in direction of Kurakhovka. So this is the main Ukrainian supply road, which is under complete Russian fire control. I would like to point your attention that the main focus of Russian FPV drones lays exactly in this area. We haven't received any FPV drone attacks to the west of Selido. We haven't received any FPV drone attacks to the west of Novagrodovka or to the north of Mykolaiv and Grodovka itself. The main Russian focus, FPV drone focus, is taking place exactly in this area. So everything that is coming to this direction from the Ukrainian side can be destroyed and will be destroyed by the Russians immediately. For example, in this video we can see how the Ukrainians were trying to redeploy another artillery system Caesar, but as a result of FPV drones attack, that artillery French production, the French artillery system was destroyed. In this video we can see another light vehicle that Ukrainians were using maybe for evacuation or bringing some reinforcements and reserves, but that vehicle was destroyed. In this video we can see a group of Ukrainian soldiers who were trying probably to evacuate or to move back, but they were spotted, discovered by the Russians, and were attacked by FPV drone and were attacked by drone bombings. In this video we can see how the Russians were attacking and destroying the Ukrainian communication equipment that they were using for Starlink, for FPV drones, and many other things. So we see complete control over the territory. The Ukrainians have no chances, but the most important is that we see this focus over this line for previous 3 days. So everything, so the Russians haven't moved further, which means that the forces are located almost on the same level. There are very heavy clashes for Galicinovka, for Ukrainsk, Lysivka. So I'm trying to tell you that as soon as we receive first, let's say, geolocations and first videos of Russian FPV drone strikes somewhere in the vicinity of Izmailovka and Novoselidovka, so somewhere from this area, this first of all will mean that the Russian forces moved not just their focus of FPV drones, but also their troopers moved on the ground. So we are waiting for additional progress of FPV drone operators, and furthermore we see the direction where the Russians are moving their FPV drones, and usually the direction of movements of forces is the same as the direction of movements of FPV drone forces. So it's like the same, so they're always moving in the same direction, and we see this direction, and this is the Kurakhova direction. Now let's move back a little bit back to Novagrodovka. During the previous 24 hours we still haven't received even a single video from the city city of Novagrodovka. The only thing we have is the video that how the Russians were FPV droning the Ukrainian positions. So summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that most likely there are still some parts, some islands of resistance inside of the city, because according to geolocations, the Russians managed to secure and to capture the territory completely, but the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation still hasn't provided us this information. So most likely there are still islands of resistance from the Ukrainian side, which the Russians are trying to clear one by one, step by step. So let's wait for additional updates. Most likely the Ukrainians still control the landfill to the west of the city. The Russians haven't managed to capture this. So anyway, let's wait for additional updates. Now let's talk about Grodovka, and today, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, neutral sources, the city of Grodovka was captured completely. And the most important is that the Russians managed to cross the Zhuravka river, because the part of Grodovka that was captured is located on the Ukrainian side of Zhuravka river, which is very important. The Russians managed to cross the river, and they began improving their positions already on the Ukrainian side. Of course, there are lots of trenches in the fortifications that obviously is a very powerful defense belt that the Russians will be forced to pay a lot of time to cross the territory, but it's just a matter of time, as I understand. Now let's move further and let's talk about New York and about Donetsk agglomerations. According to information we have, the Russians, as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, managed to establish complete control over the city by the name of Pivnichne. The Russians call the city of Kirova, so we are talking about this area, and we have colored the natural borders of the city in Russian favor, so we have added additional black. Currently, the main clashes are taking place on the border between Pivnichne and Donetsk, and the main clashes are taking place in the high-rise building area. At the second or the third day in a row, the Ukrainian sources are publishing the videos of how they were counterattacking the Russian forces in the area of high-rise building areas. Most of those attacks were repelled by the Russians, and Ukrainians, always suffering losses, were forced to fall back. So very difficult and complicated situation. From one side, the Russians captured the citadel, but on the other hand, the Russians currently are not moving further. I'm not sure what is the reason why the Russians are not moving further. Maybe the Russians are moving further, but we are not receiving anything from different mappers about this progress. So let's wait for a little bit, and obviously sooner or later we're going to receive additional reports and additional updates. Now let's talk about the Chasiv Yar direction. As for the city itself, there were no changes, just some pictures of fire anomalies, which confirms very heavy clashes on the territory of the city. But the most important updates are coming from the village of Grigorovka. And the Russians, according to different sources, redeployed some forces from the Chasiv Yar direction to the Kursk direction. So that's why, due to the lack of infantry and some problems with reserves and some ammo and so on, they decided not to continue their offensive in the central part of Chasiv Yar, and the Russians decided to stabilize the situation, to dig in deeper along the Seversky Donetsk Canal, and the Russians decided to secure and to clear the positions around the Chasiv Yar. And according to information we have, according to the geolocations, the Russians answered the village of Grigorovka. So it's like logical, the Russians can't continue in the central part of Chasiv Yar. There is a citadel, you need a lot of forces, there are problems with the supply and support along Seversky Donetsk Canal. So for now the Russians decided it's better for them to finish with Grigorovka, because as for Grigorovka, the Ukrainians is the side who has problems with the supply and support. So that's why the Russians most likely during the next few days will secure the territory to the north of the village of Kalinova, and they will take under control this part, and of course they will secure the territory. They will reduce the number of Ukrainian soldiers on this side of Seversky Donetsk Canal. Maybe by this time, by the time the Russians finish the battle, the Russians will, let's say, achieve some very big objectives in the Pokrovsk, or the Russians will be able to stabilize the situation in the Kursk, and some forces will be returned back, and then the Russians will renew their offensive to the Chasiv Yar. Who knows? So something like this is happening right now. As for the Sivers direction, we haven't received anything important during the previous 24 hours, just regular updates of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainians, the concentrations of Ukrainian forces inside of the city itself. Lots of, as you can see, explosions, FAPs, missiles, everything is coming, always in direction of Sivers, but the Ukrainians still hold their lines. Now let's talk about the Kupiansk direction. As for the southern direction, there are as regular activity. The Ukrainians suffer losses, but without any changes on the ground. As for the northern direction, as you can see, we have a lot of changes. The Russians, after a very short pause, resumed their offensive, and as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to cut the main supply road that goes between the city of Berestova, village of Berestova, and the city of Kruglyakhovka. So the Russians cut the main supply road, and we have this information was confirmed by different mappers, and pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, and neutral mappers. And the most important is that now we see that the Russians are about to create another Cauldron. Just yesterday we discussed that the Russians established complete control over the village of Stelmakhovka. We have the video how the Russians were raising the Russian flag, which is 100% confirmation about the control over this territory. And obviously the Russians are not going to sleep, they are not going to stop, they will continue moving further in the northwestern direction. And if the Russians are able to move to the west and to the northwest of Stelmakhovka, if the Russians are able to move further to the south of Vajana, most likely the Ukrainian forces who are currently located in the triangle between these villages of Vajana, Berestova, and Stelmakhovka would be encircled, and they would be forced to fall back. Either they would be encircled and destroyed between these fields. So something like this is currently taking place here. Now let's move further, and now let's talk about the Kursk direction, where the Ukrainians continue their offensive, but currently we can't say that they continue their offensive. Most likely the Ukrainians were stopped, and they stopped completely. But we need to understand the difference and understand the real reasons why the Ukrainians were stopped. The Ukrainians were stopped not because the Russians managed to concentrate millions of soldiers and to repel every single Ukrainian attack. The main reason is that the Western countries didn't authorize Ukraine to use their weapon to attack deep inside of Russia. Without Western weapon, without HIMARS systems, without ATACMS, without Storm Shadows, without all these Western missiles, planes, aircrafts, and bombs, and so on, the Ukrainians can't move further. The Ukrainians don't produce their own weapon. They have just Western weapon. So to move further in the Kursk direction, they need to attack the Russian positions behind Kursk. And they can't do this because they are not authorized. So that's why the Ukrainians, they have been waiting for these authorizations for the previous months, but Western countries didn't give them this authorization. So most likely the Ukrainians will stop their offensive, and most likely the Ukrainians will begin redeployment of their forces back to the Pokrovsk area. And telling the truth, according to information we have, according to different independent, analytics, the Ukrainians have already begun this process. They have already redeployed the forces of 47th Mechanized Brigade, and most likely they will continue this process. So the Kursk offensive was stopped without even being launched or something like this for in full scale. So just yes, they managed to capture a lot, of course, but most likely the Ukrainians would be forced to leave everything in the Kursk area, and they will be forced to return back in the Sumy region. So not very good for the Ukrainians, as I understand. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.